Hey there! Welcome to SUPlift, a place where ideas meet with resources to create something special. And today, we have a very special guest, Zoltan Vardy. Hello, Zoltan.
Hi, Kuba. Hi, nice to see you again.
Zoltan is incredibly special for us because he has helped numerous startups over his time in the business, and he's helped them through a launch code he created. This is the name of the company that helps the startups. And at the same time, he's an expert in scalability and sales from, let's say, previous, I was going to say life, but this is something I'm going to ask him in a second. So he is a full package for a starting founder and also the founders that found their calling. Okay, so once again, thank you for being here, Zoltan, with us.
Absolutely, nice to be here with you.
And I'm going to jump straight to the question about the launch code. Could you tell us, please, what it actually is and what does it do?
Sure. So the Launch Code is a business development framework that helps business-to-business focused tech startups to scale their sales on a global basis by applying sort of a 9-step approach to planning and to executing their sales strategy. What that means in practice is that it's tapping into sort of my 30 years of experience in global sales, in business-to-business partnerships, in scaling about a dozen companies in various markets around the world, built really on 3 pillars. So the first pillar is focus, which is basically to create a very clear, concise, and easy to understand offer and message to your target customers so they understand why they should buy what you're selling. The second pillar is sell, and it's about creating a scalable sales model through a combination of outbound sales, inbound marketing, and building partnerships with third parties. And finally, the third pillar is execute, which is about just creating a very clear set of guidelines that enable you to execute with absolute clarity. From goal setting to managing and tracking your performance to building a scalable team. And the reason that I've built my framework on these 3 pillars is because it addresses, I think, 3 of the most critical problems that most startup founders have, which is they are unable to take their business to the next level because their business lacks focus. So they don't have a really clear idea of who they're speaking to and what they need to say in order for that potential customer to take action. They don't really have a structured, consistent approach to selling, but it's more about, I know this person, I know that person, I can have a conversation with them or that, but there's nothing really that you can follow as a blueprint. And finally, there's, for lack of a better term, a sort of a chaos, right? A kind of a messy environment in which startups are building. And in that case, it's difficult to really follow an organized approach to building a business. So what I've done is I've captured all of the lessons I've learned from closing about $2 billion worth of revenues over the course of my career in various capacities as an executive, as a founder, as an investor, and now as an advisor, to help really companies and founders in this sort of business-to-business space basically build a long-term viable, successful business.
Okay, so let's go back to this time before being an advisor. Could you tell us what is actually your background that you brought to the startup ecosystem?
Mm-hmm. So I've built my career on 2 pillars. I have about 20 years of experience in the corporate world as a senior executive, mostly in the media and entertainment industry. And I have about 10 years of experience as an entrepreneur, as an investor, and as an advisor. And I think that combination of 2 worlds is what I think makes, in many ways, my approach quite unique, because I've lived in the environment where you're in a very, very planning focused, highly structured, very, very rigid environment of planning everything in advance, of doing everything and presenting everything in 200-page PowerPoint presentations, and really focusing on that side of the business and not focusing on execution. But I've also been on the other side, which is where you're sitting on a box in an empty apartment, building a business from scratch, and all of the execution that comes with it, but also the lack of planning that sometimes is in that environment. And so my professional background really reflects the learnings I've had from those two different worlds. In the corporate world, I was senior vice president of global ad sales for NBC Universal, based in London. So I was responsible for a $650 million revenue business covering 30 countries around the world in the television side of the business. Before that, I was CEO for Central and Eastern Europe at a large TV broadcasting group owned by the German group ProSiebenSat.1. So I was responsible for 5 TV networks across Central and Eastern Europe. So I've seen the world from that view. But I also was a 20-something founder who left a corporate job to build what they used to call .com companies back in the day, not startups. So I've experienced that personal challenge in that environment in which you have to build something from nothing. And I've also sat in probably a couple of hundred pitch meetings where founders have pitched to me, and I've made investments in their business and have tracked and supported them as an advisor, as a board member. So really, it's that combination of those two worlds that I think has created the foundation for the Launch Code, but also for the way that I work with startup founders.
Okay, so if I may ask, what made you change from something that, if I understand the corporate world, was a very certain environment, and change to a place, of uncertainty with startups?
Well, when you reach a certain age, and I think that's somewhere between age 40 and 50, you actually find yourself at a fork in the road. And one fork leads to a continuous commitment to sort of the clear path of sticking with it, of sticking to that sort of very structured environment that the corporate world offers, with all its benefits, financial, safety, comfort, but also its drawbacks, the fact that you really are a slave to the system, so to speak. And the other fork in the road is really about creating something that's going to have a lasting impact on the world. And, in some way, I'd say, an interest in making a dent in the universe. And so I faced that sort of fork in the road when I was 46, and I made the decision to go left instead of right. And so I made the decision not to continue my corporate career and to do something different. It was not an obvious choice. I was working in a very big role in London, in a skyscraper corner office, all the trimmings of a comfortable corporate life. But I didn't feel like I was adding just as much value to the world there as I could in a different role. So I did have a couple of my own entrepreneurial ventures when I first started back in 2017, 18. None of those really reached a level where I thought I would make a full-time commitment to any of them. And about 2.5 years ago, I made a decision. And that was that I was going to invest my time and resources into myself and into creating something that would add value in a meaningful way to startup founders. And so that's how the Launch Code was born. The Launch Code, as I've just described it, is a system. So it's an approach, it's a framework. It's also a company. So it's me and 4 or 5 colleagues of mine who work with me to promote the business, to reach out to founders, to build partnerships and relationships with other like-minded organizations, accelerators, venture capital firms, various conferences. So really, I can work with those companies to build a healthier ecosystem, especially in Europe, which is where the focus of my efforts have been. And so that sort of outcome is something I'm very happy with, and I think that if I just look at the last couple of years and the impact I've been able to have on so many founders, helping them, grow their business to a level where they're realizing the personal and professional benefits of building a global business, it's really rewarding, and I'm very proud that I've been able to take this step.
So actually, you've a little bit stumbled upon my next question, which would be, what do you perceive to be the biggest success of the Launch Code?
Well, the success of the Launch Code is measured in a number of ways. I think the first and most noticeable success is that it forces founders to start thinking in a much more structured way about their business. So really narrowing down their focus on who it is that they actually want to reach and speak to. A good example of this is a company I worked with in the UK called Bots and Us. This is a company venture funded that uses robots to provide services to large warehouses, usually in sort of global air cargo centers, and they help these warehouses manage their operations much more efficiently by using robots to move and manage all sorts of materials and boxes and things that go through that air cargo space. Those guys actually had to pivot because they were previously focused on the retail sector. And with COVID, they found that the retail sector wasn't really conducive to their solution. So one of the things I worked with them on is how do you pivot what you're offering to a whole different target audience? And so finding that focus is something that they've been very successful at, and they're in the process now of building their base of operations and their customers in that new space. I would consider that to be a success. The second pillar about sell, which is about this kind of systematic approach to selling and scaling, scalable sales model. There I'd say there are numerous companies I've worked with. Perhaps one I'd highlight is a company called Ruby Logic. They're a Polish, basically development firm that works with automobile factories in creating kind of efficient production lines and production operations. And so, for instance, they, over the course of their work, developed a unique solution, a service they call Action Audit, which is basically a mobile-based service that enables factories to audit their processes more efficiently, completely paperless, and with a much greater speed than in traditional ways. So, for instance, there I worked with them to create a very clear, scalable sales system, reaching out to the right customers through outbound marketing, outbound sales, generating leads and interest from inbound marketing, and building partnerships with companies that can help them get in front of their potential customers. So that's, I think, a great success story. And on the third pillar, which is about execute, that's one where I think that a number of companies have benefited from this. I would highlight a company called Invention Factory. They're based in Budapest. They're basically a organizational development focused company who is now in the process of raising the level of their organization to match their revenue growth. So they've grown dramatically on the revenue side, but their organization isn't quite up to speed. And so they've managed to take on a lot of the things that I've taught in the Launch Code to create a much more international, capable organization. All of these are just examples of how you can take different elements of the Launch Code and apply them to your business. As to what the long-term impacts of this type of relationship are, that's something that is evolving. What I like to say is that my promise to my customers is that if you go through this system and you apply its principles and its tools, because there are literally dozens and dozens of worksheets and tools and things that illustrate all these different points in detail, then you will be able to add about 3 to 5 new customers to your business on a monthly basis moving forward, because it's just going to create that really efficient, clear, consistent, and organized approach to building a business.
That's very interesting. And it gives me an idea for a question to you, because Launch Code seems incredibly structured, right? So you have 3 pillars, and founders can benefit from this. But within those pillars, I don't hear a lot of information about the product itself. It's and I also, when I was preparing for this interview, I of course looked at your activities on the internet and what you post, and there are a couple of moments when you actually try to create a debate about a sales guy versus a product guy, and I was wondering, what do you think about product then?
So I've very purposely chosen this niche of sales and business development because that is where I have the most experience. That's where I can offer the greatest value to potential business-to-business founders, which is not to say product is not important, but the companies that I work with are past the stage where they're trying to figure out what their product is. So I really only work with companies that have an existing product or service They are in the market already. They've already had some initial feedback from paying customers, and they're at the stage where they kind of have two sets of issues to address. One, they're stuck, right? So they don't necessarily see how they can expand and accelerate their sales activities effectively. Or they've reached a stage where actually they're doing okay, but they really want to grow internationally, right? They want to go into new markets. They want to build a global business. And so I've purposely focused on this area because I think that there's a lot of people out there who are really good product founders, right? So there's, traditionally speaking, technology focused people, programmers, guys that or women that have a really strong understanding of how to develop a product or service. Where there's a huge gap, though, is of founders who are actually capable of packaging that product or service in a way so that people want to buy it. And I think that is really where I can add a lot of value, and where I believe that the greatest need is in the startup ecosystem, broadly speaking, and certainly in Europe, and even more specifically in Central and Eastern Europe.
I understand. So you don't look for companies that are still in the moment of product validation. So in order to come into the Launch Code,
they're in a point where they've actually had the product, have gotten feedback from the market, haven't necessarily found product market fit just yet, but certainly are not very far from that. Okay, so I don't work with companies that it says I've got an idea for something. For me, I have an idea for something is probably about 5% of where they need to be in order to build a successful company. And I speak from very personal experience, from my own experience as an entrepreneur. I do believe that you have to be able to turn that product into something that people will buy, and that's the process that I'm able to help them achieve more quickly than if they were to do it on their own.
I will ask you the question later about what you actually look for in founders. But let's take a little bit of a step back and still concentrate on the Launch Code, because a lot of founders from our group are always interested in mistakes. Do you see in your career as a founder, or maybe from the Launch Code, I don't mind, you can choose whichever you want. Can you see any mistakes that you've made as a founder that you wouldn't make having the knowledge you have now?
Well, I had highlight two things: one from my own experience as a founder, and one from my experience with the Launch Code. So I became an entrepreneur first in my late 20s, and this was a time period when the internet was still in its early stages, and kind of this .com environment was growing. So companies like Amazon and Google and Yahoo were just a few years old. This is the late 90s. I was actually working as a vice president of sales for CBS Television in Los Angeles. And I was bitten by the internet bug, and actually went out with a partner, and we raised about $1.5 million of seed capital to launch what we called the kind of a network of internet portals. So think of like Yahoo at the time for Central and Eastern Europe. And so I left my job in Los Angeles. We raised the money. We started here in Budapest, where I'm partly based. I'm based between Budapest and London, and then started building this business. And so, we were actually very successful in selling the idea, raising the money. But when we actually got to the point where we had to build the business, I came to realize that what we had done so effectively and so quickly was really just the very, very, very beginning of this whole journey. And I came to realize there that, I like to say that, success in the world of startups is 5% idea, 95% execution. And I believe that to be very true. And I didn't know that at the time. I thought, we raised the money, we got the business up and running, then, everything is going to fall into place. And as I came to realize the day-to-day grind of problems and challenges and the untold number of obstacles that you have to overcome to be a successful business owner and entrepreneur, I think I realized that I had underestimated that portion of the business. And so for me, my message to all founders out there, you can have the greatest idea in the world, but there's a huge gap, like literally Grand Canyon size gap between idea and execution. And you have to be prepared for that path. And you have to be prepared for that path to take a lot longer than you think, and a lot with a lot more difficulty than you ever thought was possible. That's my first kind of mistake that I personally made that has turned, to be an important insight that I like to share with my founders that I work with. Mm-hmm. The second comes from my experience with the Launch Code. And, I often find myself in the following position. I'll ask a founder to explain to me what their business does. And they'll start with a 5-minute monologue that starts with, well, we sort of have this problem. We work with this type of customer. We do this, but we can also kind of do that. And, they go on and on about everything to such a length of time that I actually don't understand what they do. It's a very common experience. And so I always go back and actually this is the very first step of the Launch Code, literally module number 1 out of the 9. So there's 3 pillars with 3 modules under each is value proposition. It's like, explain to me in one sentence what problem you solve, who you solve it for, and why you're better than the competition. If you can't explain that to me in a single sentence that a 12-year-old will understand, then you've got a problem. And so I think that's what I believe to be a huge challenge for a lot of founders is they actually can't explain in simple terms what they do and why they should be in business. And until you can do that, you're not going to be able to convince customers to take action. You're not going to be able to convince business partners to partner with you. You're not going to be able to convince senior team members to join your team. You have to be able to do that. And so that to me is job number 1. Once you've done that, then you can start building a lot of the other elements of sales and marketing. But you have to start there.
Very interesting, and definitely big portion of knowledge for beginner founders. So
yeah,
thank you for that.
Well, actually, it's funny you say beginner founders, but I'm actually shocked at how many companies that have been around 3, 4, sometimes 5 years still can't explain in a sentence what they do. And I've had personal experience with that. One of my first customers was a company that was in the area of social media analytics. So basically, they worked with they analyzed literally millions and millions and millions of pieces of data to identify various language patterns and so they could give companies with large bases of customers, so telecom companies, pharmaceutical companies, an insight into what their consumers think about their product and service. And this company had been around for almost 3 years when I started working with them, and they really had a difficult time explaining what they do. And one of the first things I did was kind of to start this process. And this was early on in the Launch Code, so it wasn't quite as evolved as it is at this stage. But it did highlight one of the problems that it wasn't just about a person with an idea. Actually, a lot of companies that are in the market for a while can't do this. And the impact of that is huge, right? Because if you can't explain what you do, then it's most likely that your product development is not focused. It means your customer materials, your sales materials are unfocused, right? Because you're not actually explaining people why they should care what you do. It's likely that your organization is frustrated because people aren't on the same page. They're not saying the same thing about what you do. So the impact of this is quite significant. And so it's really important that you get that right.
It's the first pillar, isn't it?
It is indeed, yeah. Yeah, the first module, yes. Literally the first point, yeah, value proposition.
Exactly. Okay, so now I would like us to go into the actual scalability, the thing you are an expert of. And let's go to the theory, maybe. How would you define it, the scalability?
Well, I think a scalability is the ability to take an existing operation and exponentially grow it without necessarily putting in the same level of effort and time and resources to reach that growth as you did when you first created it. It's not easy, and it's something that requires quite a bit of work and quite a bit of thinking. But if you can get it right, it's what enables you to really grow very quickly. The most scalable businesses are software companies in the cloud that basically you can operate whether you have 10 customers or 10,000 customers with roughly the same level of resources. Obviously, there's certain levels of technology you need and support and stuff, but broadly speaking, you can do that. So, those are the most scalable businesses. But I actually believe that you can have a service business that also becomes scalable. I'll give you a very specific example from my experience. So, the way I work is I work one-on-one with founders and founding teams, and I take them through sort of a 10-week program where we go through each of the individual modules of the Launch Code. Each week, in about 2-hour sessions, we kind of discuss each point. I give them feedback. I give them worksheets. We do that together. There's something that's accessible at the end for after each session. That in itself is not a particularly scalable business, right? Because there's only one of me and there's only 24 hours in the day. So how do you turn that into a scalable business? Well, step one is you start doing group workshops, right? So you can reach people in a group stage, maybe not as intimate in terms of its exposure to me, but still very valuable. And so I started doing workshops, and most of these workshops I actually do through accelerated programs. They'll hire me to do workshops as part of their program. So I work with Design Terminal in Hungary. I work with SK Growth Camp in Slovenia. I've had various elements of these in various accelerated programs, Reactrix in Poland, MIT Enterprise Forum in Poland, and so on. So many, many different accelerated programs take advantage of the launch code or some element of it and work it into their programs, where I speak sometimes to 10, 15, 20 founders. The next level of scalability is if you can take that knowledge and experience and actually put it online. And so that if somebody doesn't necessarily want or need that personal touch, they can access the information through online, and they get the benefit of that. And that's actually what I'll be doing now. I'll be launching the Launch Code online course in about a month. And that way customers and potential clients will be able to access my knowledge and my experience in that way. So that doesn't require me to be there all the time. And obviously with these different levels, you can offer different levels of intimacy, so to speak, with your target customers. But for all of this to become scalable, you have to create a system. And the Launch Code in many ways is simply a structured categorization of all of the knowledge I've built over the last 30 years in how to sell business to business services to customers. If I hadn't created the system, all I would be doing is sharing tips and insights through conversations. But I've actually created the system. I've packaged it. I fine-tuned it over the last 2 years of personal mentoring with literally hundreds and hundreds of founders. And so it's really become a system that I can then scale through group workshops and through online courses. And so I think for every business, they have to find those elements that they can offer to a greater audience with less and less resources. And that's what I am able to do by giving them this kind of very structured approach to sales and marketing and business development through my system, which is the Launch Code.
Have you had any experience with companies coming to you and you knowing at an instant this is not scalable, and knowing that these people will not be able, even with your help, to transform their businesses?
Absolutely. I do it regularly. I mean, I only work with about 1 out of every 8 or 10 companies that find me. So the way I work is if I get sort of inbound lead or a referral, or in some ways, I'll ask potential interested parties to fill out a questionnaire where they'll go and they'll have to answer some questions to give me an idea of, first of all, what does their business do? What's their level of development? And frankly, how committed are they to taking action now? And so, and I say this all the time, is I only work with founders who are 110% committed to taking action now, because I don't want to work with folks that are kind of just thinking about, well, it'd be nice to do this. It's like, either I'm going to do it or not do it. Like, you might know from the Star Wars films, Yoda, there's no do or not. There's no try. There's only do or not do. And that's what I believe to be the case. So I actually have that sort of first screening, so to speak. Then I meet with them online, usually through a 30-minute discussion and conversation. And there I'll ask them some tough questions, and I'll push them to see if they're really, really committed to doing this. I also get a sense of how open they are to having an external point of view, because a lot of company founders are feeling like, well, I know the best way to do things. And, and those are not people I want to work with, because at the end of the day, if they know best, then they don't need me. Right. So there's no reason for us to work together. And of course, there's a financial requirement for working with me, which is usually available for companies that have already raised their first round of funding or have some meaningful cash flow coming in on a monthly basis. And so, all of these different elements combine for me to decide who I work with. The companies I do work with, I've have, without exception, a fantastic relationship. We do the program. We have an extension of our relationship. About 75% of the companies I work with extend the relationship to another, level of engagement after the launch code is already done. So they ask me to stay on and to help them with some of the execution. And to me, that's all indication of the fact that what I'm offering seems to have value to them. And so for that reason, I often will come across companies who I just don't feel they're too early in the process for me. They haven't had enough mistakes yet to realize they can't do it on themselves. They don't necessarily have the financial resources, and frankly, they don't have the right attitude to work with an external service provider.
I understand. I wanted to ask this question after, but we went into it either way. So, what does a startup need to do to become a Launch Code alumni? I mean, what do you actually look for in a business and in a founder? Let's divide it a little bit.
So a couple of requirements. So they should be in a business-to-business service. Okay. So what I mean by that is they should be wanting to reach business customers, not consumers, right? It's not Instagram, it's, Salesforce, right? So you're looking for business customers. They should be in a position where they really are in enterprise sales. So they're selling to other businesses through personal contact and relationships. It's not, I don't really work with companies that are, subscribe for $20 to our monthly service, because that's more about generating inbound interest through marketing. I'm much more of a sales and marketing guy, and there's a difference there. So they should be business to business. They should be a service rather than a product. I very rarely work with products. My expertise is in service. I have in the past, but I generally work with services. They should be global in actually their current presence or their aspirations. So I don't work with companies that just want to be the best, business to business service provider in Poland. I work with companies that have the ambition to be international, because a lot of the elements of the launch code, and frankly, my personal background is about how do you scale into international markets. So I always say I help tech startups scale their sales globally. And I do that on purpose because I work with companies that have an international perspective, which, by the way, a startup by nature should have an international perspective. That's what makes it partly a startup. So those are three very important things. So business to business, service, and global. What also is very important is they should be at a stage of development where they have a product, they've been in the market, and they have had paying customers. And the reason that's really important, because I don't want to be in a position where we're still trying to figure out what the product is. Of course, the product is going to evolve. And in fact, many times through the course of the launch code, we realize that actually they need to start emphasizing different elements of their service in order to be relevant for their target customer, right? So there is a product evolution piece there, though it's not explicitly stated. And so I'm looking for companies that have that sort of existing presence in the marketplace and have already tried to sell what they're selling with some success, but not breakthrough success. And the third element is I'm looking for companies that are at that fork in the road, as I described earlier. So they're either at a position where they really need to figure out how to break through, get unstuck, so to speak, right? So they've got that sort of obstacle to overcome, or they really are aggressively expanding internationally because they've just simply realized that they have a relatively decent position in one market, and they just want to start scaling that. And that's where a lot of the elements of organization and the third piece, the execute piece, becomes even more important. If they match these criteria, then the best way to do is to get in touch with me. If you just go onto my website, zoltanvardy.com, they click the button, apply to work with me, and then they'll get onto a Calendly link. They can fill out the questionnaire, organize a meeting. I'll give them feedback based on the questionnaire to make sure it makes sense for us to work, to at least have the meeting. And then we'll have that 30-minute phone call or video chat. And then based on that, I'll make them an offer based on what I think to be the best way for us to work together. And then they'll have to decide. And, I think that, unfortunately, because there's only 24 hours in the day and there's only one of me, there's a limit to how many companies I can work with. So there's always these kind of slots that open up. And if somebody can jump into that slot, then that's great. If not, then they have to wait until there's an opening later.
Of course. Understandable. The thing you said about global aspirations, that's very interesting. Could you give us one or two advice when a founder is having a traction within their country, for example, but the founder has got a global aspiration? What would be the first two things or three things one should do in order to break through in order to leave their own borders?
Well, the first thing is focus. If you're in a position where you're in a strong player or a reasonably good player in a particular market, I don't think your next step is to enter the world. It's you have to pick the spots where you think you would be able to enter most efficiently. The holy grail for most European companies is to get into the US. That's great. And that's a great aspiration. I'm not 100% certain that's the best place to start, because it's good to have some presence in other larger European markets before you try to enter the States, just as a proof point. So that's the one point I would say. You'd focus your efforts on the right markets. And there's a whole set of parameters that I can offer as part of our discussions where they can decide which markets are best fit for them. The second is they do have to create that sort of scalable sales model. And the reason is because a lot of companies that are present in one market still rely heavily on cold outreach and personal relationships to build their business. That's not something that you can do on a global scale. So you really do have to create a structured, targeted, I have this, what I call the customer acquisition process, which is a 7-step process they go through in order to identify and close deals with very specific customers that meet their criteria. And so that's, they have to introduce that. Then the inbound marketing piece about, getting a visibility and leads through digital marketing, through PR, through events. When you're going into a global market, you need to be visible, right? What's the first thing that somebody's going to do when they hear about you? They're going to put your name into Google and they're going to see what comes up. They better find something that's relevant for them, right? Because otherwise, you've already lost the game and you haven't even entered the ring. And then the partnership piece, which I think is such an important element of international expansion, identifying the type of partners you want to work with, whether they're sales agents or distributors or what I call intermediaries. These are all different types of partners, and I take them through that entire process of how to build and manage partnerships effectively. So there's the focus, there's the scalable sales element, and then the third piece is execute, which is about how do you create some very clear parameters for what good looks like, right? Because when you guys say, I want to go into a global business, that's fine. But how are you going to know whether that's actually what you want to do? Are you tracking the number of conversions that you're closing? Are you checking based on the number of deals you do? Is it revenues? What are your parameters by which you track your performance? How are you going to measure your success? And so, these are all different elements that I think are critical if you want to build a global business.
Is there a timeline for scalability, for growth? I know that probably all the startups have a different timeline, different roadmaps, but do you consider that there is a timeline for growth?
Well, one of the great things that I actually have a podcast of my own. It's called Launch Stories, where I talk to successful global entrepreneurs, sometimes startups, sometimes investors who have contributed to building or have built a successful global business. And I had one of my guests is a company called Ontavo. Founders are a husband and wife team who it's basically a loyalty platform for the retail space and for large global customers. They basically have a customer loyalty platform, technology platform, and these guys have been at it for 11 years. And when I interviewed them, I said, what is it that you'd say to customers or to startup founders about how long this takes? And Zsuzsa Kecmar, who's one of the founders, said, just know that it will always take longer than you think. And so I think that this sort of Hollywood story of I start on Monday and I raise my first 10 million on Wednesday and I exit on Friday. Is just that. It's a Hollywood story. It doesn't really happen. And if it does, then you're Facebook, right? But, that comes around once in a generation. You have to be prepared for the long haul. You have to be committed to sticking with this for the long haul. And so, whether that long haul is 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 12 years, I don't know. Some of it depends, quite frankly, on your level of persistence, right? Because might be a point where you say, I've been in this for too long. I can't break through. I'm moving on. But there are plenty of startup founders who simply won because they stuck with it. One of my good friends from university, I went to Cornell University in the United States, and one of the guys I graduated with, a good friend named Mark Wallace, he he took a different path when we finished university. A lot of the folks that we graduated with all went into banks and consulting companies and, law firms and so on, kind of traditional professional organizations. He went off and basically started a tech company. And we would meet every once in a while, and he'd give me an update. And, he was talking about his struggles, and he was building a company and so on. And, sometimes we would look at each other and say, oh, poor guy, he's chosen the wrong path. Well, he ended up selling his company for over $100 million to Symantec back in the early 2000s. And when I spoke to him about what he thinks was the key to his success, he said, look, Zoltan, I think about 4 or 5 times I came home from work and I told my wife that we're done. I literally don't have enough money in the till to pay our people. But every time that happened, I found some completely unexpected solution to that problem. And the difference between me and all of the other guys who didn't make it is simply I just never gave up. And so I think that sort of mentality is something that is critical for a startup founder to be successful. Whether that takes 3 years, 10 years, 12 years, nobody knows.
Okay. And going to our last 2 questions, it's very closely connected to what you've said previously. Could you tell us one advice, just one, for a beginner founder that you could give from your experience or from just your knowledge of the startup environment? Mm-hmm.
Well, look, my advice has nothing to do with the right messaging to a customer or the right turn of phrase in your sales model or all that stuff, because all that stuff is stuff you can learn, right? I mean, it's something that you can through your own personal experience, through through working with folks like me, through gathering information and from other startup founders. Those are all skills that you can learn, and unless you're completely incapable of doing that, it's over time you will learn these skills. It goes back to what I just spoke to about recently, is that it really does come down to what's in your head. And I think that if you look at the most successful entrepreneurs in the world, and I'm talking about the Steve Jobs and the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezos and the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, people have built game-changing, era-defining companies. The characteristics that they have are focus. They really, really just try to do one thing really, really well, and they will not let anyone have them stray from that vision. They're very agile. They're able to make decisions quickly on the run, solve problems effectively, just get over that next set of obstacles before they come across the next set of obstacles. So they're very agile. And thirdly, they're very persistent. They simply have an incredible belief in their mission. They know that they will stop at nothing to achieve what they've set out to do. And that combination of focus, agility, persistence is what's going to really define successful entrepreneurs, and is what's going to help folks who are listening to us talk right now reach their objectives.
Okay, and then one piece of literature or a video, or actually anything that you could direct our founders to go to in order to extend their knowledge or maybe get inspired.
So the book that I want to recommend actually is not particularly startup focused, but it's one that has served me well throughout my career, and one that I recommend to the founders that I work with. And it's called The 1 Minute Manager, and it's by a guy named Ken Blanchard. This book is about 100 pages long. You can read it in about an hour, and it effectively sets out a very simple model for how to effectively manage an organization. It's not particularly technical. It's not particularly revolutionary. It just creates a very simple set of 3 concepts of setting objectives, of giving feedback, and of setting people straight if they stray the path. This book has sold about 14 or 15 million copies around the world, so it's very, very well known. I happen to have met the founder. He's an older gentleman now. He's in his mid to late 80s. Very interesting guy, incredible business thinker. And the reason I recommend this is because if a company, if whether you call it a startup or a small business, is to scale, it has to learn how to build an effective organization. And this is a very simple book that helps you do that. So I would recommend it very much to everybody.
Okay. All right, Zoltan. I think this is all the time I wanted to take from you.
Okay.
So we are incredibly grateful that you agreed to talk with us. I know that our members will be incredibly interested and inspired by what you had to say. So yeah, thank you very much, and hopefully see you next time.
All right, Kuba. Thank you very much.
SUPlift Talks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.